When World War II ended, the skies over Europe fell silent, but the competition for air superiority was far from over. Almost immediately, a new conflict began to take shape. One defined not by declared battles but by ideology, intelligence, and preparation. As the United States and the Soviet Union sized each other up, both sides understood that the next war, if it came, would be fought at jet speed. And in that moment of urgency, former enemies suddenly became valuable assets. Among the most unexpected of those assets were German fighter aces of the Luftwaffe. These men had spent years fighting Allied pilots in some of the most intense aerial combat ever recorded. They had survived thousands of sorties, mastered tactics against numerically superior forces, and adapted rapidly as air combat evolved from propeller-driven dogfights to early jet encounters. By 1945, many of them were prisoners of war. But instead of fading quietly into history, some were offered a second, deeply ironic role. Under programs tied to Operation Paperclip, they were quietly pulled from POW camps and interrogated not as criminals, but as experts. The reasoning was simple and ruthless. These pilots had faced overwhelming Allied air power and still managed to inflict serious losses. They understood how air combat really worked under pressure. Not in theory, but in life-or-death reality. Even more importantly, many of them had fought late in the war against aircraft that shared design philosophies with emerging Soviet fighters. Their experience made them uniquely qualified to anticipate how a future enemy might fight. So the United States made a calculated decision. Instead of discarding this knowledge, it absorbed it. Former German aces were relocated, often quietly and with little public acknowledgement. Some were brought to the United States. Others worked with Western European air forces that would soon become part of NATO. Their pasts were carefully downplayed, and their new roles were tightly controlled. They were not paraded as heroes. They were used as tools. Their job wasn't to fight anymore. It was to teach. They debriefed American and Allied officers on Luftwaffe tactics, explaining how German pilots had countered bomber formations, exploited weaknesses in escort patterns, and survived against superior numbers. They broke down mistakes. What worked, what failed, and why. In an era when jet combat was still largely uncharted territory, this kind of insight was priceless. Flight manuals could explain how an aircraft performed. These men could explain how pilots behaved when fuel was low, visibility was poor, and death was seconds away. Some were asked to simulate enemy tactics during training exercises, flying mock engagements that mirrored the aggressive, energy-based combat style later associated with Soviet doctrine. Others consulted on aircraft testing, helping evaluate how Western fighters might perform against hypothetical adversaries. Their feedback influenced training syllabi, engagement rules, and even the way pilots thought about air combat psychology. For many American officers, the situation was uncomfortable. Just years earlier, these men had been shooting at U.S. pilots. Some had worn uniforms tied to a regime responsible for unimaginable crimes. But the Cold War created a brutal moral calculation. The Soviet Union was now seen as the greater threat, and any advantage, especially one grounded in real combat experience, was considered worth taking. For the German pilots themselves, the transition was equally complex. Some saw it as a chance at survival and professional redemption. Others viewed it as a continuation of their identity as aviators, detached from politics and ideology. Flying had been their world, and now that world had simply shifted sides. Few spoke publicly about their emotions. Silence was part of the deal. What made this transformation so striking was how quickly it happened. Within a few short years, men who had once defended the skies of the Third Reich were shaping how Western pilots prepared to face the Soviet Union. The enemy had changed, but the sky remained the same, and experience still mattered more than loyalty. This quiet reuse of former adversaries reveals something essential about the early Cold War. It wasn't driven by sentiment or justice. It was driven by fear, speed, and the belief that the next war could start at any moment. In that environment, yesterday's enemies became today's instructors, and moral lines blurred in the shadow of nuclear tension. The paperclip pilots weren't symbols of reconciliation. They were reminders that in the race for dominance, nations were willing to rewrite the rules of loyalty, so long as it helped them stay one step ahead in the sky. As the Cold War settled in and the rivalry between East and West hardened, air combat entered a completely new era. Jets replaced propellers, speeds doubled, and the margin for error shrank to seconds. In this unfamiliar landscape, Experience mattered more than ever. And that's where the influence of the former German aces quietly reshaped the future. They weren't just recounting old battles anymore. They were helping rewrite how air wars would be fought. One of the most important contributions these pilots made was shifting the way Western air forces thought about dogfighting. During World War II, many Allied doctrines emphasized formation flying, rigid procedures, and strict adherence to command structures. The Luftwaffe, by contrast, had encouraged flexibility, initiative, and individual decision-making in the air. German aces had survived by reading the fight in real time, conserving energy, and striking decisively rather than relying on tight formations. As jet combat emerged, those lessons suddenly became relevant again. Jets couldn't turn tightly like propeller aircraft. Mistakes happened faster, and recovery was harder. Former Luftwaffe pilots emphasized energy management, situational awareness, and disengagement, concepts that would later become foundational in NATO air doctrine. These ideas filtered into training programs, shaping how Western pilots approached combat not as a scripted maneuver, but as a constantly evolving contest of speed, altitude, and timing. Their experience also proved invaluable in understanding a potential Soviet opponent. Many German pilots had fought aircraft designed under similar philosophies to early Soviet fighters, prioritizing climb rate, durability, and aggressive engagement. By breaking down how those aircraft behaved in combat, the former aces helped Western planners anticipate what Soviet pilots might do in a real confrontation. This wasn't guesswork. It was drawn from thousands of engagements fought under extreme pressure. Training exercises began to reflect this thinking. Mock enemy squadrons adopted tactics designed to mimic aggressive adversaries rather than predictable ones. Pilots were taught to expect deception, sudden reversals, and unconventional attack angles. This approach forced trainees to think, adapt, and survive rather than simply follow checklists. Over time, it produced pilots better prepared for the chaos of real combat. The influence extended beyond tactics into mindset. German aces stressed the psychological side of air warfare, the importance of confidence, discipline, and knowing when not to fight. They spoke openly about fear, fatigue, and overconfidence, lessons learned the hard way. In a Cold War environment where a single mistake could escalate into a global crisis, that emphasis on restraint was just as important as aggression. But this transfer of knowledge came with controversy. Many of these men had flown for a regime responsible for immense atrocities, and their rehabilitation into Western military systems raised difficult questions. Their pasts were often sanitized, their roles minimized in public discourse. Officially, they were consultants or advisors. Unofficially, they were shaping the backbone of Western air strategy. This moral compromise reflected the broader reality of the Cold War. Survival and deterrence took priority over justice. The fear of falling behind the Soviet Union drove decisions that would have been unthinkable just a few years earlier. Air superiority was seen as essential, and any edge, no matter how uncomfortable, was considered necessary. Over time, the lessons these pilots shared became embedded in doctrine, manuals, and training philosophies, long after their names faded from memory. The emphasis on flexibility, pilot initiative, and energy-based combat would later be validated in conflicts like Korea and beyond. Western pilots didn't just inherit aircraft, they inherited a way of thinking about the air battle. By the early years of NATO, the transformation was complete. The techniques once used against Allied pilots were now being refined to defend them. Former enemies had become architects of deterrence, helping shape a system designed to prevent the very kind of war they had once fought. The story of the Paperclip pilots is ultimately about adaptation in a world racing toward confrontation. It shows how quickly alliances can shift when survival is at stake, and how knowledge, once acquired, rarely stays on one side for long. In the Cold War, victory wasn't just about weapons or numbers. It was about learning faster than your enemy. And sometimes, that meant learning from the people you once fought in the sky.